Hello everybody, I would like to start by saying thank you to Auntie Gloria for her welcome to country, and to our Aboriginal leaders past, present and future. I say thank you for sharing your beautiful country, and I am so sorry for the pain that it has caused you. Some years ago, I was teaching the Introduction to Philosophy course at Murdoch University. Whenever I say that, there were one or two people in the audience who say, I took it. We structured the course around some of the great philosophical questions that have perplexed philosophers for basically a couple of thousand years. Questions like, does God exist? Do only people matter? Is the world a dream? Are humans machines? And invariably, at the beginning of each semester, one or two students would tap hesitantly on my door and come in and say, ask me whether, because they couldn't come to all the lectures, could I please just give them the answers so they could check their understanding of the material? Now, if that made you smile, it's probably because you know that there are no answers to those big philosophical questions. Well, that's not quite true, because those of you who know a bit about philosophy will know that, for example, St. Augustine thought that he'd conclusively proved that God was both perfect and real with his ontological proof. And Descartes thought that Descartes definitely existed largely because he could think about being a dream. But the point is that there are no uncontested answers to those big questions. There's no objective way of deciding whether the idea that, for example, humans are much more than machines is better than the idea that humans are only machines. Now, if you were observing humans on Earth from, say, Mars, and you were trying to work out what makes us tick, you might assume at this point that a bunch of people who don't have a way of knowing conclusively who they are or what matters or what the world's like, or indeed whether the world even exists, would be pretty dysfunctional. If we don't have a way of answering some of those fundamental questions, how do we even get out of bed in the morning, let alone get ourselves along here today to Bunbury's first TEDx? Of course, the interesting thing is that we all do actually have our own answers to those questions. We don't have those answers because we've all suddenly become brilliant philosophers, or because we've suddenly got insights that have been denied to centuries of thinkers. We have answers to those big questions because we have a sense of what matters to us. Each of us here today could put forward a fairly coherent argument, and I'm not guessing what the argument would be, but we could all put forward a fairly coherent argument about whether God exists. About, for example, whether it's okay to eat chickens but not to eat people. About whether a machine that makes random choices could be genuinely said to have free will. So I've always seen my role as a philosopher not to provide the answers to those questions, but to work with people to help them see how absolutely sophisticated and complex and very, very interesting is that process that we go through when, out of a whole range of ideas, we decide which are the ideas that matter to us, which are the ideas that make us who we are. So, at this point, let me put to you the question, what is my role now as a philosopher who's also the MP for the South West, a political leader in our any town that we've been talking about today? Am I in a position to give you answers to the big political questions? Can I tell you which of your ideas is better than the other ideas? Well, before I answer that question, let me just put on record something that you won't hear many politicians say very often, if ever. So in the privacy, the complete privacy of these four walls, I will admit to you that it seems to me that politics in Australia is in real trouble. In fact, I'd go even further than that and say that I find myself agreeing with a range of commentators who have made the point that politics globally is in a state of crisis. A very high-flying corporate friend of mine was telling me that he went to a big international conference recently where he and a whole bunch of other very high-flying corporate types workshopped the concepts of power and influence. And what he told me was that not once during this lengthy workshop session was a connection made between power and influence on the one hand and politics, political parties, parliaments, governments on the other hand. Some of you might know there's a wonderful American writer called Parker J. Palmer, whose book, Healing the Heart of Democracy, starts with the basic premise that the heart of democracy has been broken, that we, the people, feel both voiceless and powerless because of this kind of toxic political culture that we're now living in, where we find our politicians swinging between the two extremes of recklessness and timidity. Now, let me tell you why I think this has happened by introducing you, the citizens of any town, to your neighbours down the road in a hypothetical place that I'm going to call Erewhon. And those of you who can spell backwards or who are familiar with obscure British Victorian fiction will know that Erewhon is actually nowhere spelt backwards. So the citizens of Erewhon are actually very much like you, the citizens of any town. They work hard, they love their family and friends, they glory in their beautiful environment with its mix of beaches and bush. They do their best to take care of people who are less advantaged than themselves. Most of them think that they're doing a bit better than their parents before them and their grandparents before that. They vote at every election largely because they want to, not because the law forces them to. And the politicians in Erewhon have always been seen to be basically good people who did their best to make sure that good rather than bad things happened in Erewhon. That's the happy part of the story, because then something terrible happened in Erewhon. It started with a series of really, really bad decisions that were made about some really, really important things, like, for example, whether it was right for the Erewhons to go to war, or whether it was right for the Erewhons to increase taxes on people who were immensely rich. Alongside these bad decisions were some other decisions that people just found puzzling, like, for example, why some but not other consenting adults could marry each other, why some but not all refugees were allowed to stay in Erewhon. And then, of course, along came Erewhon's own global financial crisis, and even if they weren't personally affected, the people of Erewhon were badly frightened. And they began to lose faith, to lose confidence in their political leadership. What about ideas? Well, sadly, what happened in Erewhon was that the distinction between radical and activist and terrorist began to be blurred, and so ideas became dangerous things. It became much safer to stay at home, to lock the doors, to hang out with people who thought like you, rather than go out there and scale the barricades and contest ideas. In fact, politics wasn't talked about in Erewhon very much anymore. The word on the street went like something like this. There's no real poverty or disadvantage in Erewhon anymore. So we're living in a kind of post-political era. What we need from our political leaders is just sound economic governance. We don't need passionate advocacy for fairness, justice and equality. Now, it probably won't surprise you if I tell you that the politicians of Erewhon didn't respond to this situation by being passionate advocates for fairness, justice and democracy. What they did was they gave the people exactly what the people wanted. In fact, what they did was they turned a well-established political process absolutely on its head. Previously, the well-established process consisted of 3 steps. First, political leaders talked about what they valued, what mattered to them. So it might be things like fairness, justice and equality, although different politicians would have different lists depending on what mattered to them. Second, they would put together a list of policies, a political program based on those values. So, for example, things like free state education, universal access to healthcare, better public transport. And third, they would carefully craft their messages so that the two were always connected. So that, for example, every time a political leader was talking about better public transport, they were also talking about freedom and equality. Every time they were talking about universal healthcare, they were also talking about justice. Now, what happened after this terrible change in Erewhon was that no politician ever talked about values anymore. What they did was they stood that process on its head. First of all, they sent their researchers out to find out what the people of Erewhon wanted to hear their political leaders talked about. Second, they put together what another great American writer, George Lakoff, calls a laundry list of political promises based on the feedback from that research. That list is now carefully sanitised, so it doesn't even really offend their political enemies. And third and finally, what the politicians of Erewhon did was they attacked their political opponents' laundry list of promises, largely on the basis that you can never believe anything a politician says anyway. Now, you won't be surprised, I suspect, to hear me say that I don't predict any happy ending for the story about Erewhon. That, of course, is because once the people of Erewhon abandoned the political field, they left it open to be taken over, basically by two other groups. The first group was people who could afford to buy power and influence rather than earn it, and the second group were extremists who cared nothing about democracy or democratic values. Now, thankfully, Erewhon is only an imaginary place. Of course it's only an imaginary place. And I've told you the story of Erewhon because I think it helps make sense of what I'm going to say about how I see my role now as a political leader in any town. As a philosopher, what I've always said to people is philosophy is thinking about thinking. It's not immensely difficult because actually you do it all the time. And you get better at doing it the more you do it, or the more consciously you do it. It's just like riding a bike or learning to read. When you learn to read, you can't go to a library and get out a book that's called Teach Yourself to Read. You actually learn by doing it. And philosophy is exactly the same. It's a very, very exciting pursuit. Come and be part of this. So, if philosophy is thinking about thinking, what I say to you now is politics is thinking about living. Thinking about living. And all those same points apply to the pursuit of politics. It's not immensely difficult. You do it all the time. You get better at doing it the more you practice doing it. But above all, there are no right answers. There's no clear and objective way of coming up with solutions to political problems. There's no formulaic way of assessing which ideas matter to you, which ideas make you the person that you are. If what you want from me is those clear, simple answers, I don't have them for you now about the big political questions any more than I have them for you about the big philosophical questions. But what I do have for you is a promise and a challenge. My promise is that while we're talking about ideas, while we're talking about the ideas that we've been talking about today, that you talk about to each other, then there is still hope for any town. While we're listening to each other's ideas, those ideas will grow and they'll flourish. And the more we trust each other to be respectful of our ideas, the more confidently we will make the link between our ideas and between what we value, what matters to us, and what makes us who we are. Now, I cannot promise you that this is going to be easy or quick or painless. Indeed, I think I can probably say that it's likely to be hard and messy, and it will almost certainly be unpredictable. After all, if the example of Erewhon is anything to go by, it's much safer to run away. But here's my challenge to you. My challenge is to arm yourself with ideas, to arm yourself with our ideas, with your ideas. My challenge to you is to delight in how sophisticated and how complex and how absolutely interesting is the process of deciding which ideas are better than others, which ideas matter to you, which ideas make you who you are. And I promise you that if you can come and be part of this, that you will be sowing the seeds for a community that is indeed full of life. Thank you.